There are moments in life that seem small, yet change everything. A door bursts open, the cold beam of a flashlight cuts through the darkness, and from that instant, a story about justice and prejudice begins. Diana Marshall, 38 years old, was a black woman living on a quiet corner street. To her neighbors, she was just another face, an ordinary woman who came home late, jogged in the mornings, and spent evenings by her window with a book, easy to overlook, invisible in plain sight. Yet behind that calm exterior lay a strength forged through years of resilience. That night, Diana awoke to the sound of splintering wood. 3 uniformed men stormed in, their boots pounding against the wooden floor. In their eyes, she was not a woman asleep in her own home. She was merely a suspicious black woman, a shadow painted by their prejudice. But on Diana's bedroom wall hung something they did not expect: a dark blue jacket, with 3 golden letters blazing across the back: FBI. In that moment, Diana understood. Her life was about to take a sharp turn. This was not just a raid. This was an opportunity for truth to surface, and for justice to speak at last. It was the kind of night where silence wrapped the neighborhood like a heavy blanket. Streetlights flickered, and the hum of an old air conditioner was the only sound inside Diana Marshall's modest home. She had gone to bed late, exhausted from another long day, unaware that within minutes, her world would shatter. At exactly 2:03 a.m., the door crashed inward with the violent roar of splintering wood. 3 officers stormed in, their flashlights slicing through the dark like blades. The sound of boots pounding across the hardwood floor echoed through every corner of her house. Diana sat up abruptly, sheets tangled around her legs, eyes squinting against the sudden glare. "Hands where we can see them!" the lead detective barked, his tone dripping with authority and assumption. To him, she was not a woman startled from her sleep. She was a suspect. To him, she was not an innocent homeowner. She was a threat. And more than anything else, to him, she was a black woman. And that was enough. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm. Years of quiet resilience had taught her to control her breathing, to master her own fear. She raised her hands slowly, watching how their eyes scanned her room, not with care but with suspicion. Drawers were yanked open, papers scattered across the floor. The sergeant, younger and more impulsive, sneered as he kicked aside her belongings. "Looks like we hit the jackpot," he muttered, as though the chaos they created justified itself. The captain lingered by the doorway, his silence far heavier than his words. He was the overseer, the one ensuring this raid had no witnesses except the trembling woman in front of them. And then it happened. The detective's beam of light froze on a navy blue jacket hanging on the wall. Across the back, bold letters spelled out 3 unmistakable characters: FBI. For 3 seconds, the room held its breath. The sergeant's breathing changed, the captain's throat tightened, the detective's hand shook ever so slightly. But pride is a dangerous thing. Instead of stopping, they pressed harder. They could not afford to back down, not after seeing what they had just seen. To admit a mistake now meant unraveling years of arrogance, years of unchecked power. So they chose denial. They chose intimidation. They chose to continue. Diana saw it all. She noted the hesitation in their eyes, the way they avoided acknowledging what that jacket represented. She memorized badge numbers with the precision of someone who knew this night was not an accident but an inevitability. She recalled the clock flashing 2:05 a.m. and carved it into memory like a legal record. She understood something vital. These men were not here by mistake. They had chosen this house. They had chosen her. And the reason was not crime. It was prejudice. It was the kind of systemic racism that hides under the uniform of authority, convincing itself that power can erase accountability. The sergeant rifled through her dresser, hands trembling slightly as if some part of him understood the weight of his actions. Diana did not shout or cry. Instead, she asked, her voice calm and deliberate, "Do you have a warrant?" The room froze again. The detective smirked, unwilling to give her the dignity of a proper answer. "We don't need one, sweetheart. Noise complaint." Diana tilted her head, her calm unsettling them more than anger ever could. "A noise complaint does not justify breaking down a door and searching drawers. You've already exceeded your authority." Her words cut through the night air like steel. This was not just defiance. This was education. She spoke not only for herself, but for every black woman whose voice had been silenced, for every neighbor too afraid to speak back, for every person of color treated as guilty before proven innocent. The captain finally stepped forward, trying to reclaim control. "We received reports of drug activity," he said. Diana locked eyes with him. "From whom? What specific probable cause justified this?" Their silence was louder than their noise. Anonymous tips, vague suspicions, none of it stood against the law. And Diana knew the law. She knew it better than they did, because unlike them, she respected it. The detective's jaw tightened. He reached for her purse, flipping it open with a theatrical flourish. His hand moved too smoothly, too deliberately, slipping something small into the side pocket. When he pulled it out, the sergeant's grin widened. "Well, well, look what we have here." A small bag of white powder caught the flashlight's glow. The kind of evidence that destroys lives. The kind of evidence too many black men and women had seen appear out of nowhere, like magic born of malice. Diana's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of amusement but of certainty. On her nightstand, her federal credentials folder sat in plain sight. Next to it, an encrypted phone held 15 years of case files. And in the lamp above them, a hidden recorder had been running since the moment the door exploded. She spoke clearly, her voice steady. "This is a false arrest based on planted evidence. The officers have entered without probable cause or a warrant." The sergeant grabbed her arm roughly. The detective snapped handcuffs around her wrists, but she continued to speak, her words slicing through the static of their radios. "I do not consent to this search. I request immediate legal counsel. I request a supervisor. I request that this body camera footage be preserved for federal court." Her persistence rattled them. Normal people panicked. Normal people begged. But Diana was not normal, not in the way they wanted her to be. She was deliberate, composed, and unafraid. Her knowledge of constitutional law was not a shield she stumbled upon. It was a sword she had sharpened for years, waiting for the right battle. And now, that battle had arrived at her doorstep, uninvited, but inevitable. This, dear listener, is where the real story begins. Because this was never just about one raid or one mistaken door. It was about a system where anonymous tips become excuses, where prejudice becomes probable cause, and where being black becomes justification enough for suspicion. It was about how power, when unchecked, festers into arrogance, and how arrogance eventually trips over its own lies. Diana Marshall was not simply a victim of that system, she was its reckoning. And as the patrol car pulled away from her shattered home, as broken glass glittered in the streetlights like silent witnesses, Diana sat in the back seat with her hands cuffed and her eyes unbroken. They thought they had silenced her. They thought they had control. But what they didn't realize was that every violation, every insult, every racist assumption they hurled that night was not burying her, it was building her case. A case not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told their rights did not matter because of the color of their skin. This is the story of the wrong door, kicked open at the wrong hour. The story of 3 officers who believed their badges placed them above the law. And most importantly, the story of a black woman who refused to be broken, who turned silence into strategy, and who transformed a midnight raid into the opening chapter of justice. From this moment on, every move they made would be recorded. Every word they spoke would become evidence, and every ounce of prejudice they carried would be exposed for what it truly was. And as we move into the next chapter, remember this. Sometimes the greatest revolutions do not begin in courtrooms or at protests. Sometimes they begin in the quiet strength of someone who knows their worth, who knows the law, and who refuses to let racism write the final word of their story. The ride to the station felt endless, though it lasted only 15 minutes. Diana sat in the back of the patrol car, wrists cuffed, back straight, eyes fixed on the reflection of her captors in the glass. The detective drove in silence, jaw clenched. The sergeant shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat, sneaking glances at her as if trying to read the expression on her face. She did not look afraid. She did not beg or protest. She observed. Every word they whispered, every nervous glance they exchanged, every radio call that filtered through static, she cataloged it all like evidence on a checklist. They thought she was helpless. They thought the cuffs, the flashing lights, and the uniformed presence meant control. But control is not always about who holds the handcuffs. Sometimes, control belongs to the one who refuses to be broken. Diana carried herself not as a victim, but as a witness, a recorder of truth, and that terrified them more than if she had screamed. When the patrol car finally pulled into the station's underground bay, she felt the shift in the air. Inside the gray concrete walls, the system felt stronger. Here, the weight of bureaucracy was supposed to crush anyone daring to resist. Booking desks, fingerprint machines, fluorescent lights that hummed like an endless warning. It was designed to strip away humanity. Yet Diana walked through it all with her head high, forcing the officers to confront the unsettling truth. Their suspect was not panicked. She was precise. At the booking desk, the sergeant presented her belongings: wallet, keys, purse, the small bag of powder they claimed to have found. The desk officer typed mechanically until the computer screen flashed a warning. He froze. His eyes darted between the screen and Diana, then back at the detective. "You need to see this," he said. The detective leaned in, his face drained of color. The system had flagged her identity: federal agent, 15 years of service, current assignment, public corruption unit. For a moment, the room was suspended in disbelief. The sergeant coughed nervously. The detective's hand trembled on the desk, and the captain muttered a curse under his breath. Diana simply watched, her calm more powerful than any badge on the wall. "So," she said softly, "now you know why I asked for your badge numbers." Her voice was steady, almost tender, but it struck like a hammer. This was the moment most people might think the nightmare would end. That recognition of her status would force them to apologize, release her, and undo the harm. But systemic prejudice does not yield so easily. Pride is a stubborn shadow, and racism is a heavier weight than truth. Instead of stepping back, the detective leaned closer. "Doesn't matter who you work for. Tonight, you're just another suspect." His words dripped with contempt, not just for her position, but for her very existence. Diana met his stare. "No. Tonight, you're suspects, and every word you speak is evidence." The sergeant growled under his breath. "Smart mouth for someone in cuffs." Diana tilted her head slightly. "Knowledge isn't arrogance. It's survival." That line hung in the air like a verdict. For countless black men and women, survival had always required knowing the law better than those sworn to enforce it. For Diana, it was not just survival, it was her mission. While they escorted her down the hall to a holding cell, a young officer stood in the corner, watching. Officer Sarah Johnson. She had joined the force with ideals of justice, but years in the department had taught her how quickly those ideals could erode under pressure, silence, and complicity. Tonight, as she replayed body camera footage on a small monitor, she saw the detective's hand slip the bag of powder into Diana's purse. Frame by frame, the truth stared back at her. She felt her stomach twist. She had heard rumors, whispers in the locker rooms, but seeing it with her own eyes, recorded on her own equipment, was different. It was undeniable. It was corruption caught in the act. Johnson's conscience became the battlefield. Loyalty to her colleagues pressed on one side. Her oath to protect and serve pulled on the other. And then, in the footage, Diana's voice rang out clearly. "I did not consent to this search. This is a false arrest." It was calm, factual, and powerful. Johnson closed her eyes and imagined if that were her mother, her sister, or her friend. Would she stay silent then? The answer was obvious. Meanwhile, inside the holding cell, Diana sat on the hard bench, her wrists sore from the cuffs, yet her mind was anything but still. She replayed the night's events like a movie reel, every violation carefully catalogued: unlawful entry, lack of warrant, excessive force, planted evidence. She knew that truth alone was not enough. It needed to be preserved, documented, verified. That was why the recorder in her lamp still ran. That was why she had spoken loudly, deliberately, for the body cameras to capture. She was not only surviving the raid, she was building a case, brick by brick. And in that case, prejudice would no longer hide in shadows. It would stand trial. The detective returned to the holding area, folder in hand, his voice heavy with disdain. "You think quoting the law makes you untouchable? We've buried stronger people than you." Diana lifted her gaze, unflinching. "You don't bury truth. You delay it. But truth always surfaces." The captain shifted uncomfortably behind him, sensing the cracks forming in their control. The sergeant avoided her eyes altogether. For every person listening to this story, there is a lesson tucked within these moments. Racism, unchecked power, and arrogance may dominate for a night, a week, or even years. But the calm persistence of truth spoken with clarity, held with courage, outlasts them all. Diana's strength was not in shouting, it was in recording, remembering, refusing to let fear silence her. That is how injustice collapses not all at once, but piece by piece, until the system has no lies left to stand on. And so the night pressed on. Diana is in her cell, Johnson at the monitor, debating whether to act. The corrupt officers are scrambling to find a way to bury their mistake. All of them were unaware that the real clock was ticking not on Diana's freedom, but on their own careers. Because every second of footage, every line of transcript, every racist word spoken would soon become part of a much larger reckoning. This is the inventory of a target, not just the belongings searched or the evidence planted, but the way prejudice inventories people of color, reducing them to stereotypes, treating their existence as justification for intrusion. Diana knew that. She had lived it. But now, she was turning that inventory around. She was documenting them, their words, their actions, their prejudice. And that, more than anything, was what made them afraid. As dawn approached, the city outside began to stir. But inside those gray walls, tension thickened like smoke. Officer Johnson's finger hovered over the upload button that would send the body camera footage to a federal server. Her heart pounded. Her conscience screamed. And Diana, sitting in her cell, whispered to herself the words she had carried all her life. Justice waits, but it never sleeps. And with that, the story moved toward its next revelation. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to breathe with tension. Fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow that flattened everything into shades of gray. Diana Marshall sat at the steel table, wrists cuffed, her back straight, her breathing calm. To anyone else, it might have looked like resignation, but those who knew her well would recognize it for what it truly was: control. She had learned long ago that panic gave power to those who thrived on intimidation. Tonight, she would not give them that power. The detective, Morrison, paced slowly, a folder in his hands. He slapped it down on the table with exaggerated force, as though the sound itself could break her composure. "You know what this is?" he asked, pulling out a photograph. The glossy image reflected the light, a small plastic bag filled with white powder. He pushed it across the table. "We found this in your purse. High-grade stuff. Street value, $5,000. You're in deep trouble." Diana studied the photo for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, with deliberate calm, she lifted her eyes to his. "I watched you put it there," she said softly. Her words dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Morrison froze. His jaw tightened. The sergeant standing in the corner shifted his weight, looking away. The captain, who had chosen to remain silent until now, cleared his throat but said nothing. Morrison leaned closer, his breath hot, his tone dripping with contempt. "Careful. False accusations can make this worse for you." Diana tilted her head, her voice steady. "So can planting evidence. And you know the difference between accusation and documentation? Documentation is what I do best." Across the hallway, Officer Sarah Johnson sat in the equipment room, replaying the body camera footage. Her hands trembled as she scrubbed back and forth across the timeline. Frame by frame, she watched Morrison's hand dip into Diana's purse, slip the bag inside, then pull it out seconds later with a theatrical flourish. The evidence was irrefutable. Johnson's stomach turned. She had heard rumors before, whispers in locker rooms about shortcuts, about making cases stick. But seeing it on her own camera, undeniable, unedited, this was different. This was corruption staring her in the face. Johnson thought about her first day on the force, the pride of pinning on her badge, the belief that she was stepping into a noble calling. She had told her family she wanted to make a difference, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But what she saw on the screen tonight made her question everything. Was she protecting the community, or was she part of a system designed to harm people like Diana, people whose only crime was the color of their skin? Inside the interrogation room, Morrison pressed harder. "You can cooperate, tell us who your supplier is, and maybe we'll talk about leniency. Or you can keep that smart mouth, and we'll bury you so deep the world forgets your name." His words carried the weight of practiced intimidation. He had used this routine before, countless times. For many it worked. Fear broke people faster than cuffs ever could. But Diana was not many people. She leaned forward, her eyes unwavering. "Do you know what's worse than fear?" she asked quietly. Morrison blinked, caught off guard. "It's silence. Silence allows lies to grow. Silence buries the truth. And I will not be silent, not tonight, not ever," the sergeant snorted, trying to mask his unease with mockery. "You think quoting philosophy will save you?" Diana shook her head gently. "Not philosophy, law. You violated the Fourth Amendment, exceeded the scope of any reasonable search, and planted evidence. Every word you've spoken tonight is recorded, every movement documented. And when this reaches federal court, you'll answer for it." Her calm unnerved them. Most suspects begged, cried, and shouted. But Diana dissected their actions like a surgeon, leaving no room for doubt. It was as though she had flipped the script, turning the interrogators into the interrogated. The captain finally stepped forward, his voice low, almost pleading. "Enough. Let's just process her and move on." His tone betrayed cracks in his armor. He knew they had gone too far, yet pride chained him to complicity. For Johnson, still watching, the weight of decision pressed heavier. Her conscience pulled at her, reminding her that truth demanded action. But loyalty whispered louder. Loyalty to colleagues, to the unspoken code of silence. She thought of the countless officers before her who looked away, who told themselves it wasn't their problem. But then she thought of Diana's face, calm and resolute, even in chains. Was she willing to let that courage die in silence? Back in the room, Morrison slammed the folder shut. "You think you're smarter than us, Agent Marshall?" His slip of the tongue betrayed what they all now knew. Diana's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Smarter? No. Prepared? Always." The lesson here is simple but profound. Racism feeds on arrogance. It convinces those in power that they can bend the truth, rewrite reality, and escape accountability. But the truth, like Diana, waits patiently. It observes, it remembers, and when the moment comes, it rises. Morrison rose abruptly, storming out, leaving the captain and sergeant behind. Diana sat alone for a moment, the cuffs biting into her wrists, but her spirit unbroken. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Justice waits, but it never sleeps." At that same moment, Johnson's finger hovered over the upload button on the computer screen. One click, and the footage would transfer to a secure federal server, beyond the reach of local corruption. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the line between complicity and conscience, between silence and justice. She exhaled slowly, then pressed the button. The file began to transfer, progress bar creeping forward, each percent like a drumbeat in her chest. Once uploaded, there would be no going back. She had chosen her side. And with that choice, the balance of power began to shift. This, dear listener, is the meaning of planting the powder. It is not just about the bag slipped into a purse. It is about how prejudice plants itself into systems, into procedures, into the minds of those who wear uniforms and believe themselves untouchable. It is about how lives are destroyed by lies staged as truth. But it is also about how courage can uproot those lies, how one act of conscience can expose corruption for what it is. The powder in the bag was never about drugs. It was about control. But tonight, as the truth uploaded line by line to a federal server, control began slipping from their hands. And Diana, sitting in that gray room, knew it. She could not see the computer screen, but she felt the shift in the air. She felt the presence of someone inside those walls who had chosen to stand with truth. And in that moment, hope, quiet, steady, relentless, took root. The night was far from over. The struggle was far from won. But for the first time, the officers who had stormed into her home with arrogance and prejudice were no longer the hunters. They were becoming the hunted. And as dawn approached, Diana whispered again, not for herself, but for every black man and woman who had suffered under the weight of planted lies. The truth doesn't disappear. It waits. The walls of the precinct were thick, but they could not contain the arguments erupting in the hallway. Diana sat alone in the interrogation room, her wrists cuffed, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like an impatient witness. Through the thin crack of the door, she could hear voices raised in frustration. Detective Morrison's tone was sharp, agitated. "She's quoting case law like she wrote the damn Constitution," he snapped. The sergeant hissed back. She's not panicked. She's calculating. This isn't normal. The captain, his voice low but firm, cut them off. Doesn't matter. Push her through processing. The faster she's buried in the system, the harder it is for anyone to pull her out. Buried. That was the word they used, as though she were already dead, just waiting for paperwork to cover her grave. It was more than intimidation. It was the language of systemic racism, the quiet confidence that the system itself would back them, that a black woman's voice would be drowned out by the hum of bureaucracy. But Diana was listening, memorizing every word, every phrase, every careless admission. She sat straighter, her calm not born of naivety but of knowledge. She knew the law, and more importantly, she knew their weaknesses. When they returned, Morrison tried to regain control. He slammed the door shut, leaned across the table, and growled, "Do you even understand what you're up against?" Diana met his eyes. "Yes, and I also understand what you're up against." Her voice carried no fear, only clarity. She lifted her chin slightly. "I need confirmation that your body cameras are recording." The sergeant flinched, his hand brushing the small black device on his chest. The red light blinked steadily, betraying the truth. "Good," she said, nodding slowly. "Because when this reaches federal court, every second of your unlawful entry, every movement, every word, it will all be evidence." The room went still. Morrison smirked, trying to mask his unease. "You really think this little performance will hold up in court?" Diana's lips curved into the faintest smile. "This isn't a performance. This is documentation. And documentation is what destroys lies." She leaned forward, speaking deliberately, as though every syllable was a bullet of truth. "You kicked in my door without a warrant. You claimed a noise complaint, but you ransacked my drawers. You planted drugs in my purse. You exceeded the scope of any reasonable search. And now you want to threaten me into silence. But I will not be silent." The captain stepped forward, his patience thinning. "We received reports of drug activity at this address," he said firmly, as if the weight of his authority could substitute for evidence. Diana raised an eyebrow. "From whom?" The captain hesitated. "Anonymous tip." Her laughter was soft, not mocking, but devastating. Anonymous tips do not justify warrantless searches of private residences. That's basic constitutional law. You know it. I know it. And soon, a federal judge will know exactly how you chose to ignore it. The sergeant bristled. "You think quoting court cases makes you untouchable?" Diana's eyes burned with quiet fire. "No, but it makes you accountable." For those listening, here lies a vital truth. Racism rarely announces itself with slurs and overt hatred. More often, it hides in procedures, in technicalities, twisted to target certain communities. It disguises itself as professionalism while trampling the very laws it pretends to uphold. Tonight, Diana was peeling away that disguise, layer by layer. Morrison snapped, unable to restrain himself. "You talk too much." He pulled out his cuffs, clicking them tighter around her wrists as though pain could break her spirit. Diana winced slightly but did not break eye contact. "You can tighten the cuffs, detective," she said quietly, "but you can't tighten the truth." Her words pierced the air. Even the sergeant shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the captain for reassurance. The hierarchy was cracking. Diana could see it, and she pressed further. "I need your badge numbers," she said firmly. The sergeant barked a laugh. "You're not in a position to make demands." Diana's voice remained calm. "Every citizen has the right to identify the officers conducting searches. That's the law. So I'll ask again. Badge numbers. All three of you." Morrison instinctively covered his badge with his hand, a reflex born of guilt. "You don't need—" Diana cut him off, her tone sharper now. "The law disagrees." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Finally, the captain exhaled and recited his number, his voice heavy with resignation. The sergeant followed reluctantly. Morrison muttered his thoughts through clenched teeth. Diana repeated each number back perfectly, etching them into memory, cementing them like entries in an evidence log. "I also need confirmation that your body cameras are intact and operational," she continued. The sergeant glanced down at the blinking light. He nodded begrudgingly. "Good," Diana said. "So when this goes to federal court, there will be a complete record. Every shove, every threat, every planted piece of evidence, you've built your own case against yourselves." Morrison slammed his fist against the table, rattling the metal frame. "You think you're so damn smart." Diana leaned back slightly, her expression serene. "No, I think I'm informed. There's a difference. For listeners, the lesson is clear. Knowledge is power. In a system tilted against people of color, knowing the law becomes a shield. It is not arrogance, it is survival. And in Diana's case, it was more than survival. It was a strategy. The captain finally snapped. Enough of this back and forth, we're charging her. Morrison pulled out the paperwork with grim satisfaction. But even as he did, doubt flickered in his eyes. Somewhere deep down, he knew the ground beneath him was crumbling. As the charges were read, possession of a controlled substance, resisting arrest, Diana spoke loudly, her voice directed toward the body cameras. I am being arrested based on planted evidence. The officers conducted an illegal search without probable cause or a warrant. I did not consent to this search. Shut up, Morrison hissed, but his words were futile. The cameras were already recording, the evidence already preserved. Diana had turned their weapons against them. This is what it means when the law is under fire. It is not just statutes written on paper. It is the lived reality of those who are supposed to be protected by it. And when prejudice twists the law into a weapon, it takes courage, calm, unshaken courage to fight fire with truth. As they dragged her from the room, Diana held her head high. Her wrists ached, her body bruised, but her spirit was untouchable. She knew what they did not. The law was not their shield tonight. It was her sword. And as she was led down the sterile hallway toward a holding cell, she whispered once more, "Justice waits, but it never sleeps," because she understood something they had forgotten. The law, no matter how abused, still has a heartbeat, and tonight, that heartbeat was hers. The booking desk was never meant to be dramatic. It was supposed to be routine, mechanical, impersonal. A place where lives were reduced to fingerprints, mugshots, and forms stacked into files. But that night, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Metro Police Precinct, the booking desk became a stage where arrogance would meet truth. Diana Marshall was led forward, wrists still cuffed, her pace steady and unhurried. The detective shoved a clipboard across the desk with unnecessary force, muttering something about another dealer off the streets. The sergeant smirked, writing up fabricated notes, and the captain hovered close, pretending his silence was authority when, in reality, it was fear. The booking officer, a man with years of monotony in his face, typed her name into the system. At first, his expression was blank, his fingers moving with the practiced rhythm of habit. But then, the screen blinked, flashed, and froze. His eyes widened. He leaned closer, tapped a few keys, and leaned back slowly, his lips parting in disbelief. The detective frowned. "What is it?" The officer swallowed hard. "You need to see this." The screen glowed with words that cracked their confidence wide open. Diana Marshall, Federal Agent, Internal Affairs Division, 15 years of service, active assignment, Public Corruption Unit. Clearance level, Federal Sensitive. Silence swept over the room like a tidal wave. The detective's jaw clenched. The sergeant cursed under his breath. The captain pinched the bridge of his nose. And Diana? She smiled faintly. A smile not of triumph, but of inevitability. "So now you know," she said quietly, her voice carrying a calm weight. "Now you understand why I asked for your badge numbers." The booking officer looked from the screen to her, then back at the three men, his discomfort growing. Protocol dictated that the moment a federal law enforcement officer was in custody, the department was required to notify the FBI immediately. Special procedures were to be followed, layers of accountability engaged. But none of that happened. Because pride is stubborn and prejudice is blinding. Instead of stepping back, instead of admitting error, Morrison doubled down. He leaned across the desk, his voice dripping with venom. "Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter what badge you carry. Tonight, you're just another suspect." His words carried not authority, but desperation. He was clinging to control, unwilling to accept that his lies were unraveling. Diana's eyes softened, but her words were sharp. "No, detective. Tonight, you're the suspect, and every word you speak is evidence." The sergeant slammed a hand against the desk, trying to reclaim dominance. "Don't twist this. You were caught with drugs in your purse. End of story." Diana tilted her head. "Not caught, framed, and the story is only beginning." For listeners, here lies the lesson. Racism clings to denial. Even when confronted with truth, it refuses to release its grip. It convinces itself that power can erase accountability. But power without justice is brittle. It cracks under pressure. In the corner of the precinct, Officer Sarah Johnson was still watching the footage on her monitor. The upload bar she had triggered earlier had completed, the file now safe on a federal server. She had crossed her Rubicon. There was no going back. And now, as she overheard the booking officer stammering about federal protocol, she realized the entire department stood on the edge of collapse. Morrison dragged Diana toward the camera for her mugshot. He positioned her roughly, ordering her to stare into the lens. She complied, standing tall, eyes unflinching. The flash captured her face, but it did not capture defeat. If anything, it captured defiance. For every black woman whose mugshot had been paraded as proof of guilt, Diana's image would stand as proof of resilience. The fingerprint machine hummed as the officer guided her hands. "Place your right index finger here," he muttered. Diana obeyed, her wrists sore but steady. The machine beeped. The system cross-referenced. And once again the screen flashed. Federal flag. Immediate notification required. This time, the booking officer looked directly at the captain. "We have to call it in," he said firmly, his voice quivering slightly. "This is protocol. If we don't—" Morrison cut him off. "Not yet." His voice was sharp, commanding, dripping with fear masquerading as control. The booking officer hesitated, torn between duty and the unspoken code of silence. Diana leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried across the room. "Every second you delay is another violation. Every choice you make tonight digs your hole deeper. When this reaches federal court, and it will, you won't just answer for corruption, you'll answer for obstruction of justice." The sergeant scoffed, trying to mask his unease. "Big words. You think anyone will care?" Diana turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. "Yes, because the law is bigger than you, and justice doesn't sleep. For those listening now, remember, systemic racism thrives when rules are bent, when procedures are ignored, when silence protects the guilty. But sometimes, a system designed to hide the truth betrays itself. Tonight, the federal database betrayed them, flashing its warning like a siren they could not silence. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. Diana was still cuffed, still locked inside their walls, but the truth had stepped into the room, glowing on that computer screen. They could not unsee it. They could not undo it, and the more they fought it, the more evidence they left behind. Officer Johnson walked past the booking desk, her eyes locking with Diana's for a fleeting second. In that glance, understanding passed between them. Two women, different uniforms, but bound by the same truth. Silence was no longer an option. Johnson gave the faintest nod. Diana returned it. Nothing more needed to be said. The captain finally barked an order. "Finish processing. We'll deal with the rest later." But his voice no longer carried confidence. It carried dread. Because deep down, he knew they were no longer hunters. They were prey. As Diana was led toward the holding cells, she spoke clearly, deliberately, her words aimed at the body cameras still recording. "I am a federal agent, detained unlawfully, based on planted evidence, and denied my rights under the Constitution. I request immediate counsel and federal notification." Her voice echoed down the hallway, carried by microphones, captured by cameras, preserved by servers she could not see but trusted. Her case was no longer just hers. It belonged to the truth, and truth, once unleashed, cannot be caged. This is the meaning of the federal flag. It is not just a message on a computer screen. It is a line drawn in the sand. It is the moment prejudice collides with accountability. It is the reminder that no badge, no uniform, no rank can shield corruption forever. Diana knew the night was far from over. The real battle had only begun. But she also knew something more powerful. The system that tried to bury her had already betrayed itself. And as dawn approached, she whispered to herself, steady and calm, "Justice waits, but it never sleeps." Officer Sarah Johnson sat alone in the equipment room, the glow of multiple monitors reflecting against her tired eyes. It was past 3 in the morning, but the adrenaline in her veins kept her wide awake. Around her, rows of body cameras sat charging in their docks, silent witnesses blinking red as files uploaded to the internal server. The hum of electronics filled the room like a steady heartbeat, yet her own heart pounded louder. She had always thought of this room as a neutral place, a backstage area far from the heat of the streets. But tonight, It felt like the most dangerous room in the entire precinct. On her main screen, she replayed the footage again, frame by frame. The detective, Morrison, his hand dipping into Diana Marshall's purse, slipping the small bag of powder inside, then pulling it out seconds later as though he had struck gold. It was subtle, practiced, almost rehearsed, but the camera caught everything. No angle could erase the truth. Sarah pressed pause, staring at Morrison's frozen hand mid-motion. Her stomach twisted. She whispered to herself, "He really did it." For years, Sarah had heard the whispers, rumors of planted evidence, shortcuts taken to secure convictions, quiet complaints from citizens that never seemed to go anywhere. She told herself it couldn't be true, that maybe those stories were exaggerations, or the bitter words of people caught doing wrong. She wanted to believe her department was better than that. But now, staring at the undeniable evidence on her own screen, she realized those whispers had been warnings, and she had ignored them. Her conscience screamed. She thought about the oath she had taken when she pinned on her badge. To serve, to protect, to uphold the law without prejudice or bias. She remembered the pride on her mother's face, the tears in her father's eyes. They had believed in her, believed that she could be part of the change, that she could make the system fairer from the inside. And now, here she was, holding proof that the system she served was broken, corrupted, and weaponized against a black woman whose only crime was existing in the wrong neighborhood. Her phone buzzed. A message from Morrison. "Delete the footage. Mark it as an equipment malfunction. Do it now." Her hands shook as she read the words. She had been given orders before routine, unquestioned. But this order was different. This was not about protecting the public. This was about protecting corruption. About burying the truth. If she followed it, she would become part of the conspiracy. If she refused, she would be marked as a traitor. Either way, her career, her reputation, maybe even her safety, was on the line. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She thought of her son, Caleb, sleeping in his room at home. He was 12, curious and bright, already asking questions about the world that she struggled to answer. He had asked her once why the news always showed black men being arrested, why it seemed like people who looked like him were always in trouble. She had told him, "Because the world is unfair sometimes, but that's why people like me are here to make it better." If she deleted this footage, that promise would become a lie. She reopened her eyes and stared at the screen. Diana's voice echoed through the speakers. "I am being arrested based on planted evidence. The officers conducted an illegal search without probable cause or a warrant." Sarah felt the conviction in her words, the calm courage of a woman who refused to be broken. How could she ignore that? How could she stay silent when silence was the very weapon used to destroy lives? Her mouse hovered over the delete button. One click, and the file would vanish, marked as a glitch, as though the truth had never existed. But then her eyes shifted to another option, smaller, tucked in the corner of the software. Upload to secure server. She knew what it was, a federal backup system, rarely used, hardly acknowledged. But it was there, designed for moments when evidence needed to be preserved outside local control. Her finger trembled over the mouse. She thought of her colleagues, the camaraderie, the laughs in the break room, the unspoken bond of surviving dangerous shifts together. Betraying them felt like betraying family. But then she thought of her real family, her son, her parents, her community. Who was she truly betraying if she stayed silent? She clicked, "Upload." The progress bar appeared, creeping forward slowly. 1%, 2%, 5%. Each number felt like a drumbeat in her chest. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Morrison. "Status?" She typed back quickly. "Working on it. Copy that." Her deception bought her time. She turned back to the screen. 15%, 20%, 30%. Her palms were sweaty, her pulse racing. If anyone walked in now, if anyone saw what she was doing, her career would be over. Worse, she could be charged with insubordination, obstruction, or betrayal. But she kept going. 45%, 60%, 75%. The footage played on a side screen as the file was uploaded. She watched Diana sit calmly in the interrogation room, her voice steady as she spoke about constitutional rights, demanding badge numbers, refusing to be silenced. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. This woman was everything the system tried to crush, knowledgeable, composed, unyielding. And yet, instead of breaking, she had turned her silence into a strategy. 90%, 95%, 100%. The file transferred. The words appeared, "Upload complete. File secured." Sarah exhaled, a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message wasn't from Morrison. It was from an unknown number. Federal server confirms receipt. Do not delete the local copy. Hold position. Reinforcements inbound. Sarah's eyes widened. They knew. The FBI already knew. Her decision had triggered something much bigger than herself. In that moment, fear and relief collided in her chest. She was no longer just an officer in a precinct protecting her colleagues. She had become a whistleblower, the bridge between corruption and justice. She closed the monitors, wiped her eyes, and whispered to herself, "I did the right thing." But the night was far from over. She knew Morrison, the sergeant, and the captain would soon realize what she had done, or at least suspect it. They would test her loyalty, pressure her, maybe even threaten her. She had to prepare. She had to protect herself. And more importantly, she had to protect the truth she had just saved. For every listener, remember this. Racism survives when good people stay silent. But silence is a choice. And courage is also a choice. Sarah Johnson made hers in a small equipment room at 3:30 inches the morning, with shaking hands and a pounding heart. She chose conscience over complicity. She chose justice over comfort. And with that choice, the course of this story changed forever. Because now, Diana Marshall was no longer alone. Assistant Director James Rodriguez was a light sleeper. 15 years in federal service had trained him to hear the subtle differences between a phone ringing with routine business and a phone ringing with urgency. That night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., his secure line buzzed on the nightstand. He answered before the second ring. "Rodriguez." The voice on the other end was shaky but determined. It belonged to Officer Sarah Johnson. "Sir, this is Officer Johnson, Metro Police. I need to report a federal agent in custody. They planted evidence. I have it on body camera." Rodriguez sat up, his chest tightening. His mind snapped into focus. Agent's name? Diana Marshall. Internal Affairs, Public Corruption Unit. For a moment, silence stretched across the line. Rodriguez knew the name well. Diana was one of his best investigators. Relentless, meticulous. For 18 months, she had been embedded, documenting systemic corruption within the Metro Police. And now, the very people she was investigating had kicked in her door, planted drugs, and put her in cuffs. Rodriguez's voice hardened. "Do not let anyone delete that footage. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir. Upload complete. Federal server has it." He exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and anger. "Good work. Now listen carefully. Keep Agent Marshall safe. Reinforcements are already on the way." He hung up and swung his legs out of bed. By the time he pulled on his jacket, his emergency team had already been alerted. Phones buzzed across Washington. Tactical teams assembled. Lawyers prepared warrants. Analysts fired up surveillance equipment. Within 30 minutes, black SUVs rolled out of the federal building, engines low and deliberate, like predators in the night. This was not routine. This was not ordinary. This was Operation Clean House. Rodriguez briefed his team inside the command vehicle. For 2 years, Agent Marshall has been gathering evidence of systemic corruption inside Metro Police. Evidence planting, false arrests, civil rights violations. Tonight they handed us the final piece. They've arrested her on fabricated charges. The footage is already secure. We have everything we need to move. The tactical leader, a seasoned marshal named Carter, raised an eyebrow. "Full federal authority?" Rodriguez nodded. "Full authority. Execute the warrants. Secure the evidence. Bring down everyone involved." The convoy sped through the city, headlights cutting through the early morning fog. Inside the precinct, the officers had no idea the storm was approaching. Morrison and the sergeant argued in hushed tones, trying to keep their captain calm. Diana sat in her cell, her wrists still bruised, her eyes unyielding. She sensed something shifting, as though the walls around her were no longer closing in but trembling under pressure. Meanwhile, Johnson paced the equipment room, her hands trembling. She had done it. She had crossed the line. But with every tick of the clock, fear gnawed at her. Would her colleagues discover what she had done before the feds arrived? Would they retaliate? Her phone buzzed again. Hold position. Federal team ETA, 20 minutes. Relief flooded her chest. She wasn't alone. Back in Washington, federal analysts intercepted Metro Police radio chatter. They heard officers discussing wiping cameras, fixing reports, making sure the case sticks. Every word recorded, every conspiracy documented. Rodriguez listened with clenched fists. These men weren't just rogue cops. They were architects of a criminal enterprise built on prejudice, protected by silence. For listeners, understand this. Corruption rarely exposes itself so blatantly, but arrogance makes people sloppy. And racism, when it becomes a habit, creates blind spots. These officers thought they were untouchable. They thought a black woman's word would never outweigh theirs. But they had underestimated the quiet power of documentation and the courage of those unwilling to stay silent. By 4 a.m., the federal convoy surrounded the precinct. Black SUVs idled at every entrance. Tactical teams took position. Rodriguez stepped out, adjusting his jacket, his breath visible in the cool night air. He looked up at the building, its concrete walls glowing under floodlights. To him, it was no longer just a precinct. It was a crime scene. "On my order," he said into his radio. "All units, federal jurisdiction is now in effect." Inside, chaos simmered. The captain barked orders to expedite Diana's transfer to the county jail. Get her out before anyone starts asking questions. But before the transport van could even pull into the garage, the power flickered. Radios crackled with static. A booming voice cut through every channel. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This facility is now under federal jurisdiction. Stand down immediately." Panic erupted. Some officers reached for weapons. Others froze, unsure. The sergeant muttered, "What the hell is happening?" Morrison's face drained of color. He knew. He had heard whispers about Operation Clean House, the quiet investigation they all hoped was just a rumor. Now, the rumor had arrived at their door. Diana, still in her cell, closed her eyes and exhaled. The sound of boots storming the building, the metallic clank of battering rams, the echo of commands justice had come, not with whispers, but with thunder. Johnson, in the equipment room, watched as federal agents poured in, securing servers, seizing body cameras, and locking down evidence. One agent approached her. "Officer Johnson?" She nodded nervously. He handed her a sealed envelope. "You're coming with us. You're a protected witness now." Tears welled in her eyes, but she stood tall. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her badge lift. Downstairs, Rodriguez entered the holding area, flanked by agents. He stopped in front of Diana's cell. For a moment, their eyes met mentor and investigator, trust forged through years of service. He unlocked the door himself. "Agent Marshall," he said with quiet pride, "you've done your job. Now let us do ours." She stood, her wrists aching, but her spirit unbroken. "They thought they buried me," she said softly, "but all they did was hand me the shovel." For every listener, remember this. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is patient, silent, gathering strength in the shadows. But when the moment comes, it moves like a storm, unstoppable and undeniable. Tonight, Operation Clean House was not just an investigation, it was a reckoning. As dawn broke over the city, the precinct buzzed with federal agents cataloging evidence, reading rights, and escorting corrupt officers out in cuffs. Morrison shouted about being framed, the sergeant pleaded ignorance, and the captain tried to claim authority. But none of it mattered. Their words were drowned out by the chorus of truth, the footage, the reports, the testimonies. And in the middle of it all stood Diana Marshall, no longer in cuffs, wearing her FBI windbreaker, her badge gleaming in the morning light. She was not just a survivor of injustice. She was its architect of accountability. Operation Clean House had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courthouse was packed. It wasn't a trial yet, but it might as well have been. Suppression hearings rarely drew a crowd, yet this one had reporters scribbling furiously, families filling the benches, and lawyers from across the city whispering to each other with anticipation. Everyone knew this hearing would decide not only the fate of Diana Marshall, but the credibility of an entire police department. Diana sat at the defense table, no longer in handcuffs, no longer wearing the plain clothes of a detainee. Instead, she wore her FBI windbreaker, a symbol of who she truly was, not a suspect, not a victim, but a federal agent who had turned the system's corruption into evidence. She sat upright, calm, her eyes fixed on the judge. Across from her, Detective Morrison sat at the prosecution's table, his face tight, his posture stiff. He wore a suit, but it did nothing to disguise the sweat beading on his forehead. The sergeant sat behind him, trying to look composed. The captain leaned back, arms crossed, his jaw clenched in defiance. The judge, an older black man with silver hair, looked over the case file, his brow furrowed. Judge Harrison had presided over countless hearings in his career, but this one carried a weight he could feel pressing on his shoulders. He looked up. "We are here to determine the admissibility of evidence obtained during the arrest of Agent Diana Marshall. Counsel, proceed." Diana's attorney, a woman named Evelyn Price, rose to her feet. She was sharp, confident, and precise. "Your Honor, what happened to my client is a textbook violation of constitutional law. Officers forced entry into her home without a warrant, under the guise of a noise complaint. They exceeded the scope of any lawful search, ransacking drawers and closets. And when they failed to find what they were looking for, Detective Morrison planted evidence in her purse. We have the footage to prove it." Morrison's lawyer jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. These accusations are outrageous." Judge Harrison raised a hand. "We'll let the evidence speak." Evelyn gestured to the technician at the side of the courtroom. A screen flickered to life. The body camera footage began to play. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the images appeared, the door exploding inward, Diana raising her hands calmly, demanding a warrant. The sergeant's hands rifled through her dresser. And then, the moment that changed everything, Morrison's hand slipping the bag into her purse, then pulling it out seconds later with a practiced announcement. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled frantically. Families shook their heads in disbelief. Morrison's face went pale, his jaw tightening as though he could hold back the truth through sheer force of will. But the footage was undeniable. Evelyn let the clip play twice. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Detective Morrison, do you deny this footage shows you planting evidence?" Morrison stammered. "That's not what it looks like. It was part of a legitimate search." "Legitimate?" Evelyn cut in sharply. "You mean legitimate to frame a black woman in her own home? Legitimate to trample her rights because you assumed no one would believe her word against yours?" The sergeant shifted uncomfortably. The captain's face reddened. Evelyn turned to the jury box, even though this wasn't a jury trial. Her words were meant for the court of public opinion as much as for the judge. For years, these practices have been whispered about in our community. Evidence disappearing, charges fabricated, lives destroyed, always the same targets, always people of color. Tonight, the system caught itself in the act. This tape didn't die, because truth doesn't die. For listeners, understand this. The suppression hearing is not about guilt or innocence. It is about whether evidence can stand in court. If the evidence was obtained illegally, it is thrown out. Without evidence, the case collapses. That's why this hearing mattered so much. Because for once, the burden was not on the victim to prove innocence, it was on the system to justify its lies. The prosecutor tried to regain ground. "Your Honor, anonymous tips gave officers reasonable suspicion." Judge Harrison raised a hand again. "Suspicion is not probable cause, and anonymous tips, without corroboration, do not authorize warrantless entry into a private home, especially not at 2 o'clock in the morning." His tone was firm, his gavel striking the bench. He looked directly at Morrison. "This court has reviewed the footage. The evidence in question was planted. Therefore, it is inadmissible. The arrest of Agent Marshall was unlawful. All charges against her are dismissed." The room erupted. Reporters rushed out to call their editors. Families clapped softly, some even weeping. Diana sat motionless, her expression calm, but inside, a wave of vindication washed through her. Not triumph, not revenge, vindication. The truth had survived. But the judge wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice heavy with gravity. "Furthermore, this court finds sufficient grounds to recommend federal review of the Metro Police Department's practices. The pattern revealed here suggests systemic issues that extend beyond this single case. The Department of Justice will be notified immediately." The captain closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping. The sergeant muttered a curse under his breath. Morrison's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. The facade of control crumbled before the weight of accountability. For Diana, this was more than a personal victory. It was the crack in the wall of systemic racism that so many had fought against for so long. A crack that would widen if given enough pressure. And she knew the pressure was coming. Later, outside the courthouse, she spoke briefly to the press. Her voice was steady, her words simple. This was never just about me. It was about a system that believes some lives matter less. Tonight, the truth was preserved. Tonight, the tape didn't die. And tomorrow, the fight continues. For those listening now, take this lesson. Corruption thrives on silence, on hidden rooms and erased files. But when truth is documented, when it is preserved and brought into the light, it cannot be erased. The system may try. It may delete, distort, or deny. But the tape that doesn't die is more than a recording. It is the living testimony of courage, of persistence, of justice waiting for its moment to speak. And that moment had come. As Diana walked away from the courthouse steps, flanked by supporters, she whispered to herself once again, "Justice waits, but it never sleeps." 6 months later, the courthouse was no longer just a building. It had become a symbol, a battlefield where arrogance and corruption would finally face justice. The trial of Detective Morrison, Sergeant Bradley, Captain Wilson, and 20 other officers began on a crisp Monday morning. By then, the case had been nicknamed the Trial of the Decade. Lines of people stretched outside the courthouse steps, families who had lost loved ones to wrongful arrests, activists carrying signs demanding justice, reporters with cameras ready to capture history. Inside, the marble halls echoed with footsteps, hushed conversations, and the faint hum of tension that never seemed to dissipate. Diana Marshall walked through those halls with her head held high. She was no longer the woman dragged from her home in handcuffs. She was a federal agent, lead witness, and the architect of the case that had shaken an entire department to its core. But she did not walk alone. Beside her was Officer Sarah Johnson, now under federal protection, her testimony prepared, her courage fortified. Together, they represented not only truth, but transformation, the proof that one voice could spark a reckoning. In the courtroom, the prosecution laid out its opening statement with precision. This case is about power abused, trust betrayed, and lives destroyed. For years, the defendants operated under color of law, believing their badges made them untouchable. But the Constitution is not optional. Tonight, we will show how they planted evidence, fabricated reports, and targeted citizens based on race. And we will prove it with their own words, their own cameras, and their own arrogance. The defense tried to counter. These officers were doing their jobs. Mistakes were made, but they acted in good faith to protect their community. But even as the words left the attorney's mouth, the jury's faces remained skeptical. Too much evidence had already surfaced. Too many lives had already been scarred. The first witness called was Diana. She walked to the stand, swore her oath, and sat tall. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and steady. On the night of my arrest, I was asleep in my own home. Officers entered without a warrant. They tore through my belongings, and I personally witnessed Detective Morrison place a bag of white powder into my purse. The prosecution played the footage again. The jury leaned forward, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Diana continued, her tone unwavering. I did not panic. I documented. I knew that silence would allow them to control the story. So I spoke loudly, for the cameras, for the record, because this was never just about me. It was about every citizen who had been silenced, ignored, or erased because of the color of their skin. The defense cross-examined, trying to rattle her. Agent Marshall, you admit you were calm, almost rehearsed. Isn't it possible you were setting up these officers? Diana met the lawyer's eyes. I was calm because I knew the law. I was rehearsed because I've spent my life preparing for moments exactly like this. The only people setting anyone up that night were the ones wearing badges. The room erupted in murmurs. The judge called for order, but the impact of her words lingered. Next came Sarah Johnson. She walked to the stand, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice grew stronger with each word. She described the moment she replayed the footage, the choice she faced, the pressure to delete. She read aloud the message Morrison had sent her. Delete the footage. Mark it as an equipment malfunction. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Why didn't you comply? The prosecutor asked. Johnson's eyes glistened. Because I couldn't lie anymore. I became a cop to protect people, not to bury them. If I stayed silent, I'd be part of the problem. and I couldn't look my son in the eye knowing I chose loyalty over justice. Her words struck deep. For the jury, for the community, for anyone listening, she became the conscience of the case, the insider who confirmed everything Diana had exposed. Day after day, the trial unfolded. Evidence piled up. Text messages revealed racist jokes exchanged between officers. Quotas showed disproportionate arrests of black men and women. Reports were uncovered where anonymous tips always pointed to the same neighborhoods, the same families, the same skin color. The defense scrambled. They tried to portray Diana as vengeful, Johnson as disloyal, and the FBI as overreaching. But the mountain of evidence was insurmountable. Every attempt to discredit the witnesses only strengthened the narrative. This was not about a few bad apples. This was a system rotten from within. For listeners, imagine the tension of those weeks. Every headline carried the trial. Every evening, the news program replayed Diana's testimony, Johnson's courage, and the body camera footage. Families across the country saw their own experiences reflected in that courtroom, the humiliation of unlawful stops, the fear of planted evidence, the exhaustion of being presumed guilty because of skin color. This trial was no longer just local. It had become national. The climax came during the closing arguments. The prosecutor faced the jury, her voice firm. The defendants believed their uniforms protected them. They believed no one would question their word. They believed that targeting black citizens was just part of the job. But the law is clear. No one is above it, not even those who wear a badge. The defense tried one last plea. These are men who dedicated their lives to service. They made mistakes, but prison is too harsh. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The city held its breath. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, they returned. The foreman stood, holding the verdict forms. On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of evidence tampering, guilty. On the charge of false imprisonment, guilty. Each word echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Families cried. Reporters scrambled. Morrison slumped in his chair, pale and broken. The sergeant buried his face in his hands. The captain stared blankly ahead, his arrogance finally stripped away. Diana allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not of triumph, but of vindication. Justice had spoken, and it had spoken loudly. For listeners, the lesson here is powerful. Change does not come easily. It does not come without resistance. But when truth is preserved, when voices refuse to be silenced, when courage outweighs fear, justice can prevail, even against a system built to protect itself. The trial of the decade was not just about convictions. It was about sending a message. Racism hidden under the shield of authority would no longer be tolerated. The courtroom became a mirror, forcing society to see itself, to confront its failures, and to imagine something better. And for Diana Marshall, for Sarah Johnson, and for every family who had prayed for this day, it was proof that the tape had not died. The truth had survived, and now it had spoken. The gavel struck 3 times, echoing through the federal courtroom like the closing of a chapter that had taken years to write. The defendants, Detective Morrison, Sergeant Bradley, Captain Wilson, and 20 others, stood silently as Judge Harrison read the sentences aloud. Morrison, 20 years in federal prison for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Bradley, 12 years. Wilson, 15. The remaining defendants, between 5 and 10 years each, depending on their roles in this criminal enterprise. The words were heavy, deliberate, final. For years, these men had worn their badges like shields against accountability. Now, the very law they had twisted was holding them accountable. Families of victims embraced in the gallery, some crying openly, others simply nodding with relief. Reporters scribbled feverishly, already imagining tomorrow's headlines. Justice served in historic police corruption case. Diana Marshall sat at the prosecutor's table, her face calm but her heart racing. She had waited years for this moment, not for personal vindication, but for the chance to prove that truth, no matter how long suppressed, could still prevail. She thought back to that night, the splintering wood of her door, the blinding flashlights, the cuffs biting into her wrists. They had tried to bury her. Instead, they had given her the platform to uncover everything. When the court adjourned, Judge Harrison addressed the room with a message that would be quoted for years to come. This case shows us that justice delayed is not justice denied. It shows us that corruption can hide, but it cannot escape. And it reminds us that the Constitution applies to all, no matter the uniform, no matter the badge, especially to those who swore to uphold it. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with anticipation. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, and chants of protesters filled the steps. Signs read "Justice for all," "End systemic racism," "Truth will not die." Diana stepped forward, joined by Sarah Johnson, whose testimony had cemented the prosecution's case. For a moment, the crowd went silent, waiting for her words. "This was never just about me," Diana began, her voice steady but warm. "It was about every family torn apart by lies, every black man and woman framed, silenced, or erased because of prejudice. Tonight, a jury said enough. Tonight, the law proved that it belongs to all of us, not just the powerful, not just the privileged, but every citizen, no matter their color." Applause erupted, but she raised a hand gently. "But verdicts are not the end. They are the beginning. True justice requires change, not just punishment." And change was already underway. The Department of Justice announced sweeping reforms in the aftermath of the trial. Federal oversight was imposed on Metro Police for 5 years under a consent decree. Independent review boards were created, composed of citizens and civil rights advocates, with full authority to investigate misconduct. Body cameras were now required to stream directly to secure federal servers. No more local control, no more quiet deletions. Training programs were overhauled. Officers were required to attend anti-bias workshops, constitutional law refreshers, and community reconciliation sessions. Recruitment standards were raised, with an emphasis on diversity and cultural competence. Whistleblower protections were expanded, ensuring that no officer would ever face retaliation for exposing corruption again. The city also faced civil consequences. Lawsuits under Section 1983 poured in from victims of wrongful arrests, families torn apart by fabricated charges, and lives derailed by lies. Settlements reached millions of dollars, draining city coffers but restoring some measure of dignity to those harmed. For many, the money could never erase the trauma, but it served as recognition that what had been done to them was wrong, unlawful, and unforgettable. Diana attended some of those community meetings, quietly listening as victims shared their stories. One man described losing his job after a planted drug charge. A mother spoke of her teenage son, arrested on falsified evidence, who still carried the scars of distrust and humiliation. Their voices reinforced what she already knew. Her case was never about one night or one woman. It was about a system that had failed countless times, and now, slowly, it was being forced to change. For Sarah Johnson, the aftermath was bittersweet. She had lost friends in the department, colleagues who now saw her as a traitor. But she had gained something far greater: integrity. She was reassigned to a federal task force, working alongside Diana. Her testimony had not just exposed corruption, it had inspired other officers to step forward, to refuse silence, to choose conscience over complicity. For listeners, here lies the lesson. Racism thrives in systems where silence is stronger than courage. But when one voice speaks, others find the strength to follow. And when enough voices rise together, even the strongest walls of corruption crumble. Months later, Diana stood again on the courthouse steps, but this time not for herself. She was there to support a family whose wrongful arrest case had just been settled. Reporters asked her, "What message do you have for the community?" She paused, choosing her words with care. "That truth doesn't disappear. It waits. And when we stand together, when we document, when we refuse to be silent, truth will always find its way to the surface. Justice waits, but it never sleeps." The phrase spread, painted on murals, printed on shirts, repeated in rallies. Justice waits, but it never sleeps. It became the rallying cry of a city determined to rebuild trust, one interaction at a time. And for Diana, the journey did not end there. Rodriguez called her with a new assignment investigating abuses in immigration detention facilities. Another system in need of light. Another battlefield where silence had reigned too long. She accepted without hesitation. Because for her, justice was not a destination. It was a mission. The legacy of the trial lived on. The verdicts, the damages, the reforms, they were not perfect, not complete, but they were steps. Steps toward a future where children like Sarah's son could grow up believing the law would protect them, not target them. Steps toward a world where being black was not treated as probable cause. Steps toward justice that included everyone. And as Diana walked into the sunset of that chapter, her heart carried both the weight of what had been lost and the hope of what had been gained. The fight was not over. It never would be. But she had proven something powerful. Even against arrogance, corruption, and systemic racism, the truth endures. The truth survives. The truth wins, because justice waits, and justice never sleeps. And so, the story of Diana Marshall closes not with the sound of doors breaking or handcuffs clicking, but with the steady beat of justice finally being heard. What began as a midnight raid meant to silence her became a turning point that exposed corruption, confronted systemic racism, and reminded us all that truth has a way of surviving. For Diana, justice was never just about her own freedom. It was about every person who had been ignored, silenced, or wrongly accused because of the color of their skin. For Sarah Johnson, it was about finding the courage to choose conscience over comfort. And for all of us listening, it is about remembering that silence protects injustice, but voice calm, steady, unrelenting can transform it. As you step away from this story, carry its lesson with you. Justice waits, but it never sleeps. Truth might be delayed, but it will not disappear. And change, though slow, begins with those willing to stand when standing is hardest. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, share it with others. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience, and let your voice join the chorus reminding the world, we will not be silent, and we will not give up on justice. Because the fight is not over. It never is. But together, we keep the mission alive.